But there was some exhilaration too. I mean, Russell has a description which I think is kind of appropriate of a feeling of a godless universe is a kind of exhilarating universe. There's something hygienic about it. There's something bracing about it. Whereas the idea that there's this sort of suffocating presence gazing at your every movement and thought, and gauging everything you do, and it's a bit oppressive to think that way.
Well, okay. Now here you are, the philosopher that you thought you might become.
Yeah.
You have now very fully become. Now, in your role as a philosopher, I'd love you to develop the arguments which were previously simply intuitional skin shedding.
Yeah.
Now be more systematic and surgical about it and say why, in fact, the notion of a God is incredible.
The one set of arguments is the sort of no evidence arguments. Russell puts it by saying, there's no more reason to believe in the Christian God than the Greek gods. No more reason to believe. In other words, there's no positive evidence for it. There's no theory that you need to postulate God in to explain some natural phenomenon which can't be explained by some other theory. People sometimes will say, well, miracles were performed. There's never any good evidence that miracles were performed. The judgment that they were is usually based on a prior opinion that God exists rather than being an independent source for believing that God exists. So there's no evidence in terms of what anybody's ever observed. There's no fact about the world that can't be explained without postulating God. So there's no reason to believe in God, any more than there's any reason to believe in Zeus or any of the Greek gods. So that's on the side of whether there's any reason to believe it. There's the question now, are there reasons to disbelieve it? Are there any positive arguments against it? There are also some arguments for, like the ontological argument, when we talk about the ontological argument.
Well, tell us what that argument is.
The ontological argument. This is a very nice argument. Anselm of Canterbury thought of it. I think it must be in the 15th century. He argued that the definition of God entails that God exists. Now, this would be a fantastic result, right, if that. Just the mere definition tells that God exists. So, what's the definition of God? The most perfect conceivable being. Or let's say the most powerful conceivable being is an equally good way of putting it. And then Anselm argues as follows. Well, suppose this most powerful or most perfect being did not exist, right? Then he would lack the attribute of existence. But the attribute of existence is one of the perfections, or one of the things which makes a being powerful. But since he is, by definition, the most perfect being, he must have the attribute of existence. Therefore, God exists. Right, so let's go over the argument again. Yeah. Get the definition of God. How is God to be defined? Let's compare this with the unicorn. Well, how is a unicorn to be defined? A unicorn is a horse with a horn growing out of the middle of its head. There's nothing in that definition to imply that unicorns exist, and unicorns don't exist. But let's define God, right? An all-powerful, all-good, all-knowing being, right? These are some of his characteristics. And everybody will agree that's the definition of God. So now one of the definitions is he's the most perfect being. One of his attributes is utmost perfection, unimprovable perfection. Okay, that's the definition of God. Now Anselm argues, but if God didn't exist, wouldn't he be less perfect than a being just like him in all those attributes, except that that being existed? Because to exist is to be more perfect than not to exist. It's better to exist than not to exist. God is as good as you can be, as superior as you can be, so he must exist. So we know by definition that God exists. It's a brilliant argument, right? But it's wholly unconvincing to everybody who hears it. They think there's something going wrong with that, That's a very strange argument.
All right, tell us what's wrong with it.
The difficulty is nobody's ever managed to pinpoint exactly what's wrong with it. I'll tell you what I think is wrong with it, though the issue is not by no means clear. I think what's very funny in the bit that science strikes you as sophistical is the bit that says, God's the most perfect, existence is one of the perfections. It sounds superficially plausible, but what does it really mean, right? It's one of the perfections. I like to compare this to somebody who said, let's take the most tasty meal conceivable. The most tasty meal conceivable. Does that mean anything to say that? This is the most tasty meal I've ever had, but it's not well defined, the most tasty meal conceivable, or the best football game conceivable. Not that I've ever seen. What does it mean? I mean, it's not a very clearly meaningful idea. So if we say we're defining God as the most perfect being, and we don't really lay down very clearly what we mean by perfect, then what does it really mean, the most perfect being? He doesn't have the most perfect colours, because he's not coloured at all. What is it? It's not clear what it means. So we can't always think that phrases like the most perfect conceivable F are always meaningful. Sometimes they are meaningful. The most perfect conceivable triangle. It means one whose angles are precisely 180 degrees. But the most perfect conceivable moral being, what does that mean? It's not clear that it's so well defined. So That's what I think is wrong with it. But it's like many a philosophical argument. Just because you can't refute it, it doesn't mean you should take it all that seriously, especially if, form your common sense beliefs on the basis of it.
All right, so much for the ontological.
Yes, right, that's the ontological argument.
Now, how about the other ones?
Well, here's one I like. People think, I think psychologically this is quite important to people. That's why this argument is probably more important psychologically. People think, without God, life is meaningless. Where is meaning? Right? It's just an empty charade of, pointless and purposeless, valueless, going from one thing to the next. Well, the first reply to make to that is you don't necessarily need to seek the meaning of life outside of life. Here's the premise, the assumption of that argument. Without there being a being outside of human life would have no meaning. So the meaning of human life must be conferred by another being. Here's my question. What gives the meaning to that being's life? Right? How does his life, God's life, derive meaning? Well, here's a dilemma, right? Either God's life has meaning intrinsically just by his existence, or not, right? Well, if it does, then it's possible to have a meaningful life intrinsically. So why can't our lives have intrinsic meaning? They don't need to have their meaning conferred by another being.
But the religious might want to argue, without even reverting to the ontological proof of the existence of God, that the observable fact that we do have values and meanings is in fact evidence of the fact that something has given the meanings, in the same way that the argument from design says something has given the thing design.
Yeah. Well, I think there are 2 points there. One point is that the existence of values itself is an argument for the existence of God, like an evidence argument. Another point, though, altogether, is the idea that morality can only have a foundation if it's based on God's commands or God's desires, God's wishes. Right, now, you started with the first one, of course. The thing to say about that is there's just no reason to think that the existence of values in human society depends on the existence of God. I mean, why should it? There's just no clear logical argument for one thing. Any more than the existence of ears, is a reason. I mean, there are various aspects of human life. There's art, there's value, there's family, there's all sorts of things that we take to be valuable. Why does any of these require that we postulate God to explain their existence? A more worrying question for many people is they don't see that morality can have any foundation, can have any absoluteness, unless there's a God to certify it, legitimate it. You can see that point. It's a point that was discussed by Plato long ago in the Euthyphro argument, and he makes, well, I think Socrates makes a completely compelling case, a refutation of that argument, and it simply goes as follows. The argument, you see, goes like this. So, suppose you take as a moral principle it's wrong to steal. People say, now, why is that wrong? Why is it wrong to steal? Answer, because God says it's wrong to steal. God commanded that you should not steal. Okay. The point that Socrates makes in that dialogue is to say, well, how can God give this moral rule a foundation? Either the moral rule is itself intrinsically a sound moral rule, or it can't be given soundness and legitimacy from an external command. Suppose, for example, we had the rule, it's right to murder. And somebody said, that's not right. Murder is wrong. And somebody said in reply, but God says it's right to murder. That doesn't convince you that it's right to murder. If God says that something is right which isn't right, God's wrong. Right? He can't make something right just by saying it's right. What God has to do is reflect what's right in his commandments. So that's what he really does. It is wrong to steal, wrong to steal and wrong to murder. So God says that it's wrong, and he's right to say that. Why? Because it is wrong in the two cases. He doesn't make it wrong by saying it. He can't do that. If that was so, we'd have no reason to respect God's morality.
In that case, God, as it were, appropriates our spontaneous and indigenous values, which then get, as it were, reflected back upon this hypothetical entity, which then seems to validate our beliefs.
Exactly. So we don't need God to validate our moral beliefs. He couldn't validate them. His validations only work in as much as they correspond to what is morally right and is morally wrong. He can't make something be morally right when it's not. Another way to put it is, it can't be a matter of God's free decision or whim what's right and wrong. People can see that morality is what it is. They know what they ought to do. But human beings are weak. We're weak. We have weakness of the will. We don't always do what we know very well we ought to do. And that is, in most people, produces the phenomenon of guilt. Guilt is a powerful negative force in people's minds. People hate guilt. Right? Guilt is a bad feeling. So